The following is a presentation of Apologetics Press. In our discussion of textual variants, we now turn our attention to what would be considered a rather major textual variant. In fact, in some ways, it might be the most prominent textual variant in the New Testament. That's Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. The manuscript evidence actually contains four variants, four possible readings. Number one, you have omitting the verse, verses 9 through 20. Number two, you have including the verses, 9 through 20. Reading number three, including verses 9 through 20, but inserting another section between verse 8 and verse 9. Let me read to you what that addition is. But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. That's textual variant number three, inserting those words after verse 8, but before verses 9 through 20. And then reading number four, to include verses 9 through 20, but to insert between verses 14 and 15 a very lengthy section that I won't bother to read to you. You can go online and Google this and see for yourself what those words are, but it's a rather lengthy section that has been inserted. Now notice that only one Greek manuscript actually has that last reading, where you have between verses 14 and 15 another lengthy section. Codex Washingtonianus, which is a 5th century manuscript, but that's the only Greek manuscript that actually has that reading. And reading number three, that includes verses 9 through 20, but inserts that paragraph between verses 8 and 9. External evidence for that is very weak. In fact, it's a classic case of conflation because it incorporates both verses 9 through 20 as well as the shorter ending that came forth. So that really leads us back to the original two readings. And so we have either include verses at 9 through 20 or omit them. Here's what the American Standard Version footnote says. If you were to open an ASV, here's what is stated at the bottom of the page. The two oldest Greek manuscripts and some other authorities omit from verse 9 to the end. Some other authorities have a different ending to the gospel. Now that's a fairly complete or a very valiant attempt to represent the manuscript evidence. Now, if you were to go to the NIV, the New International Version, here's what their footnote says. The two most reliable early manuscripts do not have Mark 16, 9 through 20. May I kindly suggest to you that is a misleading statement. Well, what's misleading about that footnote? Well, that kind of a marginal notation fails to convey to the reader the larger picture that the external evidence provides for this passage, including additional Greek manuscript evidence. They just zero in on two. Well, those two don't have it, but there's many that do, to say nothing of the ancient versions and all of those patristic writers. So that can be very misleading to make such a statement for an English audience that doesn't have the wherewithal to make sense of it. Well, those who favor omission of verses 9 through 20 do so based primarily on two pieces of evidence. Number one, the external evidence for exclusion of the verses based upon the very prestigious Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that those who exclude it depend heavily upon what they consider to be the superiority of the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. They tend to give more weight to what those two manuscripts do. Number two, those who favor omission of the verses also rely very heavily on the internal evidence consisting of the presence of several words which they deem non-Markan. That is, they are words that Mark does not use anywhere else in the book. And there's a number of these. So they think, well, that's internal evidence that somebody else wrote this. This is not the way Mark would write. Let me take you very quickly through external evidence for inclusion of verses 9 through 20. This evidence, I'm telling you, is vast and it is diversified in terms of geographical distribution and in terms of age. And even though Sinaiticus and Vaticanus do not have it, the third of the big three unsealed manuscripts, Alexandrinus, does have it. Notice the apparatus at the bottom of the page, which gives inclusion, or rather omission, an A rating. And yet when you skip down to the indicator that says add verses 9 through 20, you see there that Alexandrinus is the first witness that they show for inclusion. Now let me make a couple of observations right off the bat. Vaticanus is a half-hearted witness for the omission of Mark 16, 9 through 20. Because you see, after the subscription, at the end of the book, the remaining greater portion of that column, in Vaticanus, I'm going to show you an image of it. In Vaticanus, there are 3 columns for each page, and Mark comes to an end in the second column, and yet the rest of that column is vacant, and the entire next column, to the very end of the page, are vacant. But if you look at the Vaticanus manuscript and all the other books of the New Testament, there is no other instance of this in the whole New Testament portion of the manuscript. The next book in every other instance begins on the very next column. There's not a big space, a column and a half left as there is at the end of Mark. Here is an image of that. And notice how the subscription comes to a close. According to Mark is what that means, kata markonum. And then you have nothing else, and then the entire third column is left vacant. Here's just an example of how at the beginning of Mark, notice this, I've backed up and shown you the end of Matthew. So Matthew ends, kata Mattheon, and then the third column begins Mark. And I could take you through all of the other images of that facsimile of Codex Vaticanus and show you that's the practice of that scribe throughout the book. So it's peculiar. You know, scholars have been perplexed. Why does Luke not begin at that third column? Why is it left blank? And therefore it's speculated, well, he knew that there perhaps was something else that goes there, or he himself had a question about it. Let me show you a chart that shows the manuscript evidence, including the ancient versions and the patristic writers. In this chart, the red shading shows those sources that support Mark 16, 9 through 20. The yellow shows those who do not include it. Now notice under Greek manuscripts, first column, 4th century, they have Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So see, they put a lot of weight there and say, look, you know, these are old manuscripts and they support it. But it's as if they're just conveniently ignoring the fact that when you move over to the second column under ancient versions, you have a Curetonian Syriac. In the 2nd century, you got Coptic Sahidic. In the 3rd, moving to the 4th, and look at the 5th and the 6th, and then move over to the patristic writers. You have quotations by these men going all the way back to the 2nd century and continuing right on down. So that's pretty strong evidence in terms of external evidence. And notice that's what that consists of. Is there some strong external evidence for omission? Yes, and they're shaded there in yellow. But there is tremendous external evidence for inclusion. In my personal opinion, it makes no sense to pit Sinaiticus and Vaticanus against such a wide array of external evidence to the contrary. And in fact, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus frequently differ with each other. So their combined testimony, even though you could consider it strong, I believe it's insufficient to overthrow the weighty external evidence for inclusion of the verse. It's interesting that when you examine what scholars have said about this over the last, 100, 200 years, the most persuasive piece of evidence that seems to prompt many of these textual critics to omit it, to discount it as genuine, is internal evidence, not external. In fact, they'll come out and say, wow, if it weren't for the internal, the external is pretty strong here. Let me give you a few examples. Here's a book written all the way back in the 20s by a fellow by the name of Dumelow. He says the section, referring to Mark 16, 9 through 20, is no casual or unauthorized addition to the gospel. From the 2nd century onwards, in nearly all manuscripts, versions, and other authorities, it forms an integral part of the gospel. And it can be shown to have existed, if not in the apostolic, that is the 1st century, at least in the sub-apostolic age. A certain amount of evidence against it there is, though very little can be shown to be independent of Eusebius, the church historian, 265 to 340 AD. But certainly, now listen to this, but certainly not enough to justify its rejection, were it not that internal evidence clearly demonstrates that it cannot have proceeded from the hand of St. Mark. He makes that very clear, doesn't he? He admits the external evidence supports it, but we've got the internal evidence, and that overthrows the external. Here is a very famous and conservative theologian and scholar, commentator. He wrote New Testament Introduction, Donald Guthrie. He says, if these deductions are correct, the mass of manuscripts containing the longer ending must have been due to the acceptance of this ending as the most preferable. But internal evidence combines with textual evidence to raise suspicions regarding this ending. Moving to Mr. Alford, who wrote back in the 19th century, a pretty famous Greek scholar at that time, he said concerning Mark 16, 9 through 20, the internal evidence will be found to preponderate vastly against the authorship of Mark. Moving closer to our day, very prominent, widely respected textual critic, Bruce Metzger, in his text of the New Testament, said the long ending, though present in a variety of witnesses, some of them ancient, must also be judged by internal evidence to be secondary. And so he's saying, yes, a lot of external evidence supports inclusion of those verses, but when you look at the internal evidence, we're going to have to say that it should be omitted, or at least he describes it as secondary. Well, I ask you, what is this internal evidence that is so powerful, so weighty, and so convincing that it causes many scholars over the last 100, 200 years to exclude Mark 16, 9 through 20 as having come from the hand of Mark, the inspired writer? Well, they say that the vocabulary and style of verses 9 through 20 are deemed non-Markan. Specifically, they have pinpointed 17 words and phrases in those verses that are not used by Mark elsewhere. That sounds pretty impressive. Here's John writing along, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, right on down to chapter 15. He comes to chapter 16, and in those last few verses, 9 through 20, he uses 17 words and expressions that he hasn't used anywhere else. It's almost as if another writer wrote that using his own vocabulary and peculiar expressions. Well, that's how the textual critics reason. They say that internal evidence is decisive. Well, wait just a minute. All the way back in 1869, a fellow by the name of John Broadus examined the 12 verses that precede Mark 16, 9 through 20. So he he backed up prior to verse 9. So we're talking Mark chapter 15, verse 44, down to chapter 16, verse 8. Now, this section of Mark is not a textual variant. So let's leave those verses 9 through 20. Let's back up and examine the previous 12 verses. Guess what Mr. Broadus found? He found exactly the same number of words and phrases, 17, in those verses not used previously by Mark. And as if that were not powerful enough, J.W. McGarvey came along around 1875, and he said, well, let's just apply this same criterion for determining whether the verses of a book are authentic and come from the original writer. Let's apply that same approach, that same model, to the last 12 verses of Luke. Guess what he found? He found 9 words that are not used by Luke elsewhere in his book, 4 of which are not found anywhere else in the New Testament. That leads me to conclude that no textual critic or New Testament Greek manuscript scholar has questioned the genuineness of the last 12 verses of Luke or the 12 verses that precede Mark chapter 16, verse 18. So what is the rational conclusion to these facts? Well, the genuineness of a text cannot be determined on the basis of the author's use of new or unusual words. Now, once you step out of that discussion that goes on about external and internal, we have to step back from that and ask this question. Would it matter if Mark 16, 9 through 20 were not in our Bibles? If Mark really did not write those, they were added by later scribes. I've already pressed you with this point very firmly and very strongly, and I want to press it again. I believe the evidence, both external and internal, shows that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was, in fact, from the hand of Mark, inspired by the Holy Spirit. But guess what? Those 12 verses do not contain any teaching of significance that is not taught elsewhere in the New Testament. All of those doctrines appear in other passages. And so if that passage were in fact spurious, if it were not to be there, we lose nothing. Someone says, well, that's where he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Well, wait a minute. Baptism is taught all over the place in the New Testament, from Matthew to virtually the end of the book, end of the Bible, end of the New Testament. It's not dependent upon Mark 16, 9 through 20. But as I suggested to you, I believe the evidence is decisive for inclusion. And many others in the scholarly world have drawn that conclusion. Well, observe then, suitable solutions to these differences are detectable. Even if they weren't, the original reading is one of the options. Notice that. When we're trying to decide either whether to include or omit, or if we're trying to decide between 2 different readings. Well, we know that one or the other is right. It's not as if the original reading is completely lost and we're dealing with 2 alternatives, neither one of which is God's Word. Oh, no. We have the original reading, even if sometimes we can't determine which of the 2 is the original, and we are forced to conclude that God's Word is in fact available to us. No feature of Christian doctrine is at stake in this discussion. Variant readings in existing manuscripts do not alter any basic teaching of the New Testament. Even those variants that we might, at least initially, think this is doctrinally significant, like Mark 16, 9 through 20. They pertain to matters that are treated elsewhere in the Bible, where the question of genuineness is unobscured. It's not a question, it's not at stake. You know, I've been amazed at how many of the really foremost textual critics of history. Now, I'm talking about men who literally have spent their lives, this was their life, their profession, the focus of their activity during their life, on poring over Greek manuscripts, analyzing these texts from all different periods of time. And their stated goal was, we're trying to get back to the original wording of the New Testament. We want to reconstruct the New Testament as it came from the hands, the pens of the inspired writers. That was their goal and objective. Now, can such individuals themselves become distorted in their understanding and come to wrong conclusions and maybe end up just rejecting the Bible? Yeah, they can do that. But I'm telling you, the foremost experts, the world-renowned textual critics that are widely recognized in this field of this particular discipline, widely recognized to be the top textual critics in history, they have spoken decisively on this matter of whether or not the existence of textual variants, even in large numbers, hundreds, thousands, whether or not those in any way should cause us to have any doubt about the certainty of the reconstructed text of the New Testament that we have in our Bibles. I want to take you through the blatant, bold statements that a number of these individuals made that will help you to see that this matter is settled. Take, for example, F.F. Bruce. F.F. Bruce he is now deceased. He died in 1990. He was a biblical scholar first rate. He taught Greek, in fact, at both the University of Edinburgh and the University of Leeds. He was the chairman of the Department of Biblical History and Literature at the University of Sheffield. He received an honorary doctor of divinity from Aberdeen University. He, for many years, was the Rylands Professor of Biblical Criticism and Exegesis at the University of Manchester. He, in fact, wrote over 40 books in his lifetime, many of them dealing with these matters. And he was the editor of 2 scholarly publications, the Evangelical Quarterly and the Palestine Exploration Quarterly. Listen to the statement that he made about this matter. The variant readings about which any doubt remains among textual critics of the New Testament affect no material question of historic fact or of Christian faith and practice. Let me call your attention to another first-rate scholar. Some would even say, among the top 2 textual critics in history, in the world. And that, of course, would be Bruce Metzger. He, too, died fairly recently, 2007. He was a Greek scholar, a scholar of New Testament and New Testament textual criticism. He taught at Princeton Theological Seminary for 46 years. Recognized, he was in many ways the recognized authority on the Greek text of the New Testament. He served on the board of the American Bible Society. He was the driving force behind the United Bible Society's series of Greek texts. They put out several editions over the years since the 60s. He was the chairperson of the NRSV Bible Committee, widely considered to be one of the most influential New Testament scholars of the 20th century. Listen carefully to what he had to say on this matter. A couple of quotes that'll help you to get a sense of where he was coming from. He said, even if we had no Greek manuscript today, by piecing together the information from these translations, just the translations, from a relatively early date, we could actually reproduce the contents of the New Testament. In addition to that, even if we lost all the Greek manuscripts and the early translations, we could still reproduce the contents of the New Testament from the multiplicity of quotations in commentaries, sermons, letters, and so forth of the early church fathers. That's astounding. He's making it clear that we've got so much evidence for the New Testament that you could lose massive sections of evidence and still be able to go back and ascertain how the New Testament originally read. He even made the statement, when people say, the New Testament is the book of 50,000 errors, like that article from Look magazine all the way back in 1952. And since then I've seen people say, oh, you know, the Bible has, the New Testament has 100,000 errors. Well, wait a minute. Bruce Metzger said, if a single word is misspelled in 2,000 manuscripts, that's counted as 2,000 variants, 2,000 differences. So you see, to throw out 50,000 or 100,000, again, that's misleading. It is misleading. It is sinister. It's misrepresenting reality. It's giving the impression that the Bible is corrupted. You can't sort it out. That is simply not true. These variants, not as many as they are trying to make it out to be, and the ones that we have are decipherable. Let me call your attention to two other scholars that received world renown in their work on this matter in the 19th century. We have Brooke Foss Westcott, who died in 1901. He was a British bishop, biblical scholar, theologian in Durham, England. He held the Regius Professorship of Divinity at Cambridge. His close friend was Fenton John Anthony Hort, who died in 1892. He was an Irish theologian and also a professor at Cambridge. These renowned textual critics co-edited the New Testament in the original Greek in 1881. That was a Greek text. We now have additional Greek texts that have been produced since that time, but at that time, this was the premier Greek text. They had gone back and combed through all of the manuscripts that were available at that time, and they put together a Greek text. By the way, you can get this very easily online and look it over yourself and look at the comments that they make about it. Whatever disagreements we may have with these two men, Westcott and Hort, about some of their ideas, some of their philosophy about transmission, more specifically about translation and text families and so forth, and certain text types. They kind of are the fathers of generating that theory about, well, manuscripts fall into specific text types, and that determines how important or how primary that particular manuscript is in sorting out the truth, even if you don't agree with that. These two men, I guess you could say, drank, ate, slept, lived, and breathed New Testament Greek. They undoubtedly could pick up a manuscript and read it like you and I look at an English manuscript and are able to just immediately see what's being said. I would place a great deal of stock in these fellows if you really want to answer the question, has the Bible been corrupted? Has the New Testament been distorted and we can't be sure what it reads? These men ought to be considered, their opinion, because they were far advanced from many of us in our ability to have facility with the Greek language and with reading ancient manuscripts. Well, here's what they said. The amount of what can in any sense be called substantial variation is but a small fraction of the whole residuary variation and can hardly form more than 1,000th part of the entire text. They also said, since there is reason to suspect that an exaggerated impression prevails as to the extent of possible textual corruption in the New Testament, we desire to make it clearly understood beforehand how much of the New Testament stands in no need of a textual critic's labors. These men said, all this time we're spending on textual variants and the like, it's only on a small portion of the New Testament. The vast majority of the New Testament is clear. It's come down to us unobscured, unchanged, unaffected. What about J.W. McGarvey? J.W. McGarvey was a very prominent scholar who lived, he was actually born in 1829, died in 1911, a minister, an author, preacher, educator. He taught for 46 years in the College of the Bible in Lexington, Kentucky. He served, in fact, as president of that institution from 1895 until, I believe, his death in 1911. Listen to this observation he made in his tremendous volume, Evidences of Christianity. You ought to get a copy of it. All the authority and value possessed by these books when they were first written belong to them still. Let me throw in a founding father of America, Elias Boudinot, who served as president of the Continental Congress for a certain period. You know, he's the fellow that many years after the founding, when Thomas Paine wrote his infidelic Age of Reason, in which he blasted Christianity and so forth, well, Elias Boudinot stepped up to the plate, and he, in 1801, released a volume entitled The Age of Revelation. Notice that, not the age of reason, human reason apart from God, but no, the age of revelation, the age of revealing information from God. You ought to get that. I think it's over 300 pages, but it's worth looking at. And it's certainly a far cry from Thomas Paine's work, The Age of Reason, which has made the rounds in American universities and instilled doubt in young people all over our country. Look what Elias Boudinot said on this matter. The facts upon which the Christian religion is founded have a stronger proof than any facts at such a distance of time, and that the books which convey them down to us may be proved to be uncorrupted and authentic with greater strength than any other writings of equal antiquity. That's an astute observation, and certainly one that is absolutely accurate. Then let me take you to yet another very prominent scholar. Benjamin Warfield also lived in the 19th century, died about 1921. He was professor of theology at Princeton Seminary from 1887 to 1921 when he died. He's considered to be the last of the great Princeton theologians. I believe that's a summary of his life. And he wrote some tremendous books like The Authority and Inspiration of Scripture. Listen to this observation that he wrote. Such has been the providence of God in preserving for His church in each and every age a competently exact text of the Scriptures, that not only is the New Testament unrivaled among ancient writings in the purity of its text, as actually transmitted and kept in use, but also in the abundance of testimony which has come down to us for castigating its comparatively infrequent blemishes. He also said the great mass of the New Testament has been transmitted to us with no or next to no variation. Moving to yet another scholar that is considered qualified to speak on these matters, Richard Bentley, who lived actually in the 1600s. He died in 1742. Let me give you a quick background of who this man was so that you'll have some sense of the qualifications that he possessed that enabled him to give us observations on this matter. He was an English classical scholar, critic, and theologian. He was master of Trinity College at Cambridge. He was the first Englishman to be ranked with the great heroes of classical learning. He was known for his literary and textual criticism. In fact, he was called the founder of historical philology. And he is credited with the creation of the English school of Hellenism. Listen carefully to this quote, which certainly penetrates and gets down to the point. He said, "The real text of the sacred writers does not now, since the originals have been so long lost, lie in any single manuscript or edition, but is dispersed in them all. 'Tis competently exact indeed, even in the worst manuscript now extant, nor is one article of faith or moral precept either perverted or lost in them." Let's turn to yet another renowned scholar, extremely eminent and competent, Sir Frederick George Kenyon, who lived from 1863 to 1952. Widely respected, eminent British paleographer and biblical and classical scholar. He occupied a series of posts at the British Museum during his lifetime and was president of the British Academy from 1917 to 1921. He had some very insightful things to say about the text of the New Testament and its preservation because he spent so much of his life examining it. He said, for example, the interval then between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. And the last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Another statement that he made in his book, The Bible and Archaeology, he said both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. He also said, it is true, and it cannot be too emphatically stated, that none of the fundamental truths of Christianity rests on passages of which the genuineness is doubtful. He also said, one word of warning must be emphasized in conclusion. No fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. Constant references to mistakes and divergencies of reading might give rise to the doubt whether the substance as well as the language of the Bible is not open to question. It cannot be too strongly asserted that in substance, the text of the Bible is certain, especially in this case, the case with the New Testament. And then further, he said the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book in the world. And then he further said, the Christian can take the whole Bible in his hand and say without fear of hesitation that he holds in it the true Word of God, faithfully handed down from generation to generation throughout the centuries. Indeed, textual critics have been successful in demonstrating that currently circulating New Testaments do not differ substantially from the original. When all the textual evidence is considered, the vast majority of discordant readings have been resolved. And consequently, we've been brought to the firm conviction that we have in our possession the New Testament as God intended. Alluding back to Westcott and Hort, we can confidently affirm that we have 999 1,000ths of the original New Testament intact. The remaining 1,000th is inconsequential. Well, I hope that you have enjoyed this section of our study dealing with textual variants, and in our final sessions, we'll move more to the question of translation philosophy. How do we get from the Greek manuscripts into English? I look forward to studying with you on that matter very soon. This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.